Welcome to the Private School Leader Podcast, where private school leaders learn how to thrive and not just survive as they serve and lead their schools. I strongly believe that it is possible to have a long and happy and fulfilling career as a private school leader. And my passion is to help you figure out exactly how to do just that right here on the Private School Leader Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Minkus. So we all have some bad habits, and often we try to break those bad habits. Usually we think about that a little bit more often around the first of the year and maybe make a couple of New Year's resolutions and try to break a bad habit. And I went looking for some of the most common bad habits that most people are trying to break. Just a quick list here is smoking, scrolling on social media before going to bed, and then another bad habit is going to bed too late, too much alcohol, overeating, gossip, hoarding, road rage, procrastinating, saying yes to everything. And so whatever your bad habits are, we all have them, and we all are trying to live our lives and serve our schools and see our families and just do the best that we can. And so we're all going to have some bad habits. And some of them, aren't that big of a deal as far as maybe your long-term health. And obviously that's why smoking and too much alcohol typically are at the top of the list, and overeating is in there as well, because those have long-term impacts on our health. But let's face it, habits are hard to break, aren't they? They're just, these patterns that we get into. Many of them have strong emotional motivation, strong emotional ties to it. Take overeating, for example. A lot of it might have to do with just emotional stress, and that eating is comfort, and so there's not just the habit itself and any kind of pleasure that we derive from doing the thing, but there's also the psychological psychological motivation that kind of traps us in that pattern of behavior. So we all know about bad habits, but what I want to talk about today on this episode is our habits as leaders and some bad habits that maybe we need to break. And so on today's episode of the Private School Leader Podcast, we are going to talk about the 8 worst leadership habits and how to break them. And just before we do that, I would like to give you a free gift just as a thank you for listening to the podcast. I've created a new resource for you, and it's called 7 Strategies to Effectively Deal with Difficult Teachers. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I avoid that and procrastinate and just hope that it will get better. But part of our job is dealing with difficult teachers. And I think that sometimes the reason we lack confidence is because we don't have a plan. And so I've created a plan. And this you can grab this guide over at theprivateschoolleader.com/difficult. And this will help you with those difficult teachers at your school. And I hope that it, again, like I said, gives you that courage and confidence to deal with these teachers and help them grow and help them improve. And again, the 7 strategies to effectively deal with difficult teachers, you can grab that for free over at theprivateschoolleader.com/difficult. And then I wanted to ask for a favor. This podcast is now being downloaded in 57 different countries, and more people are finding this content. And one of the ways that you can help with that is wherever you listen to this podcast, if you would write a review and rate the podcast, that actually helps the algorithm push this out as suggested content to leaders all over the world. And we want to get this content out there just as a inspiration and hopefully encouragement and hopefully a little bit of professional development for that very, very specific role that we have, which is being a private school leader. So thank you for doing that, for writing a review and for rating the podcast. And thank you most of all just for being here each week and for listening and for sharing the link with other leaders and aspiring leaders. I just really appreciate you, and thank you for doing that. So before I run off this list of 8 of the worst leadership habits for private school leaders, I just want to say that when I read this list in a moment, you might be listening and thinking, well, I don't do that. Well, I don't do that one. Well, I don't do that one. Okay, you probably don't. But I want you to think about if it's possible that you actually do that you do a really good job of not doing this, but that at certain times of day or in certain situations that you do it. And so I'll explain what I mean. See, here's the thing. When we're compromised, we tend to do things that we don't normally do. So for example, late in the day, on a stressful day, our brain is flooded with cortisol, and that impacts us in many different ways as far as our behavior. Just the cognitive load of a day at school, and decision fatigue is a real thing, and the emotional energy that it has taken to solve problems, find these elegant solutions to these complex problems, and the physical fatigue of the day. And so just like a teacher might have a more difficult time towards the end of a school year on a Friday afternoon when it's sunny and it's last period, that's a situational thing where maybe the classroom management isn't as good as it would be on a Tuesday morning in late September, okay? I just want you to think as we go through these as to maybe we need to tighten up one of these habits when it comes to when we're compromised, okay? So here are the 8 worst leadership habits, and then we're going to talk about how to break them. Number 1, micromanaging. Number 2, avoiding conflict. Number 3, not listening. Number 4, lack of transparency. Number 5, letting integrity slip. Number 6, losing sight of the student. Number 7, drifting into positional leadership. And number 8, not taking care of yourself. And so the show notes for today's episode, as usual, can be found at theprivateschoolleader.com/episode 98. And I know that I just hit you with 8 things, and that's a lot, but the show notes capture all of that for you there. So let's get into it. Habit number 1, micromanaging. So we know that micromanaging is something that from time to time that we do. I know that I do it, and I'll say this, I do it a lot more when I'm stressed. When things are going well, I don't need to micromanage my teachers. My teachers are awesome. They know what they're doing. And I was thinking about this, during COVID, I set up in the dining room. Many of us had our, spot where we would set up in the house during the shutdown. And my daughters were still living at home at the time, and they've all since moved out, but they were still living at home. And I can remember just being all stressed out, working in the dining room and having a Zoom meeting or this or that. And then I would come into the kitchen this one particular time, and one of my daughters just stops and looks at me and is like, "Dad, I know how to load a dishwasher." Okay. So obviously I was micromanaging how she was loading the dishwasher, and it had nothing to do with me caring at all about whether the bowls were there or the plates were there. It was just that I was really, really stressed, and then I was micromanaging. Another reason that we micromanage is because it's comfortable, and we micromanage in areas that are in our comfort zone. And so I've talked about this before on the podcast, but let me give you another quick example. I might have given this example before. So let's say that there's a nurse who works in the maternity ward of a big hospital, and that nurse has worked there for a really long time. And then an opportunity arises to become the supervisor of the maternity ward. And so this particular nurse, they apply, and they are hired to do this. But no one trains this maternity nurse in how to lead people this person is just promoted to lead the maternity ward. And so then what happens sometimes, and in this hypothetical case study, this is what happens, is that the maternity nurse that is now the maternity ward supervisor will tend to micromanage the other nurses because that's what's comfortable for that person. And so it might be the diapering, or it might be the taking of blood, drawing of blood, or it might be the, just some aspect of the specific aspect that a nurse would be very, very familiar with and knows exactly what they're doing, and probably drives those nurses nuts when the maternity ward supervisor is micromanaging. And so I think that sometimes, again, when we get compromised emotionally, we tend to micromanage, or sometimes we do it because of insecurity and because that makes us feel better that we're getting something done, maybe because we're leaning a little towards perfectionism and they're not doing it the way we would do it. There's all kinds of reasons why we would micromanage, but listen, it is very, very, it undermines trust significantly, because when you're micromanaging someone, you're sending them the message that you don't know what you're doing and I need to babysit you. And so we don't want to send that message to our teachers. We want to encourage their autonomy and to trust them to handle their responsibilities and to just give them guidance when they need it and to help them resolve the obstacles that come up to them being able to teach. So what are a couple of actionable tips? And this would be just action steps to break this bad habit of micromanaging. Implementing regular check-ins instead of constant supervision. And so if you're going to check in on a teacher from time to time, then you don't have to be micromanaging them and constantly supervising them. And then the other thing is autonomy with accountability. I talk about that a lot with my teachers, and setting clear expectations and then letting them rise to the occasion, and then you're just playing a supervisory role as far as them meeting expectations. It doesn't really matter. Here's the thing. Let's say you came up through as a math teacher. Does it really matter the specific way that fifth grade math teacher is teaching multiplication to their students? And if it's different than the way that you taught it, does that teacher have to teach it the way that you taught it if they're getting the results? And then finally, how do we break this bad habit of micromanaging? We need to ask ourselves the question, why am I micromanaging? And sometimes when we just pause and reflect and ask ourselves that question, it's the first step in stopping. Okay? So that brings us to habit number 2, and that is, bad habit number 2 is avoiding conflict. And I know that this is one that's hard for me, but we know that avoiding conflict will lead to unresolved issues and just tension and bigger problems. You know, we have things that are going on with parents, or things that are going on with a teacher, or maybe things that are escalating with a board member. And if that conflict is going to be uncomfortable, which most of the time it is, then we engage in avoidance behavior and procrastination. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I talk myself into, well, this will get better. You know, if it just needs some time. You know, and I think that's especially true when it comes to a teacher. You know, oh, well, they just need more time. They just need, and maybe they do, but maybe they need more support and more. Maybe they need a mentor. Maybe they need more closely supervised. Maybe they need some additional resources while they're logging that chronological time that earns them experience. Okay, so avoiding conflict. I believe that we can, as human beings, that we can talk ourselves into anything or we can talk ourselves out of anything. So we're really good at rationalizing. And, you know, just think about the negative impact on your school of avoiding conflict. You know, you lose trust with your teachers. You allow, if it's a parent that's escalating, you know, they don't feel supported by you if you're just avoiding that conflict and you just give in to the parent. You know, so it compromises your trust and your reputation. And we're not seeking conflict. I mean, let's face it, conflict is going to find us in our role as leaders at our private schools. But there are so many negative things that come along with us avoiding the conflict. And so what are a couple of things that we can do to break the bad habit of avoiding conflict? Well, the key, and I know this is easier said than done, is just to not ignore a problem and to convince yourself that it will not get better without attention. We just literally have to convince ourselves that A, this is part of our responsibility. This is part of our job. B, we want to preserve those relationships and that trust and that reputation that we've earned. But most importantly, it's the right thing to do. And just that one last thing about ignoring. I read a management book many years ago. I can't find it now, but it talked about classifying different problems. One was an elephant, one was a wolf, and one was a termite. And of course, the elephant is, crashing through your school. And so that's the giant, huge, important, urgent thing that gets attention right away. And a wolf, in a lesser way, but still it's going to get lots of attention. But that management book I'm referring to, it talked about how the termites can be most destructive because they do their work invisibly and over time. And then all of a sudden, the building falls down because of all of the damage that the termites have done behind the scenes. So you kind of get the idea of what I'm talking about. If we avoid conflict, it might make us feel better in the moment because we avoided the conflict, but it's going to be worse in the long run because of the escalation and the other things that go along with it. Okay, bad habit number 3 is not listening. So not listening to staff or students or parents or a board member, but especially when it comes to our teachers and their issues, that can really lead to resentment, disengagement. And I think that we have some problems when it comes to not listening, and they might show up in different ways. Interrupting is obviously not listening. Body language, listening with the intent to respond. You're listening, but you're just formulating your response and you're already solving the problem while you're listening. And the brain cannot effectively do more than one thing at a time. And so you can't really listen deeply if you're listening with the intent to respond. Some of us get very impatient with, everyone has a different rate and pace at which they can deliver information. And as school leaders, we tend to lean toward a much faster pace than most people because of the type of job that we have. But, that is showing on our face and with our body language, that impatience. And just really not listening and drawing conclusions on our own and not really understanding what the person is saying. So I think one or more of those things has probably shown up for you at work. It's certainly shown up for me. And we want in our schools an environment where everyone feels heard. I think feeling heard is part of emotional safety. And we want our people to feel emotionally safe. And so how can we break this bad habit of not listening? Well, I think that we just have to work on our listening by asking a question about, well, what's going on inside of me? And I know that that's another reflective question. And in the moment, you're looking to expedite this conversation, expedite this exchange of information, and move on to the next thing on the list of 1,000 things that you have to do. But that's part of the problem is that, and I do it too. It's just like everything is whack-a-mole and it's just like an assembly line and we're on to the next problem and on to the next problem. But, we're sending a message about our listening. And so just to really do the things we already know how to do, which is the active listening body language with the person that we're listening to. And then last tip on how to break this bad habit is to listen like you would to your biggest donor. Okay, listen like you would to your biggest donor. So let's say that there's a teacher, and this can be kind of difficult. Let's say it's a teacher that's been there for a while at your school, and they tend to be kind of a little bit of a complainer, and you just want this conversation to end as quickly as possible. I can hear what you're saying. You're like, yeah, right, Mark. I'm not going to listen to this person and give them the same amount of time and the same amount of patience and attention that I would to my biggest donor. But I'm telling you, it will make a difference if you can think about the people, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a student, whether it is a parent. We just have to be present for those moments in that listening. And it's so hard because the raging rapids are going on all around outside of us, beside us. But just to maybe center you and have you focus on that person could happen with this listening like you are meeting with your biggest donor. Okay. Habit number 4, bad habit number 4 is lack of transparency. So, a lack of transparency can really breed a lot of mistrust and a lot of rumors and a lot of gossip in our schools. And what we want to try to do is to be open about the decision-making process, as open as we can be. There are going to be changes. There are going to be challenges. If we can solicit feedback, if we can, when the reason that people feel like a lack of transparency is when there's something that probably could have or should have involved feedback from the teachers and some collaboration, and then you saying, okay, thank you for your input. I'm going to make the decision. I've done that. I've done it and I've not done it. Okay. And so my point is that I've made decisions and just told, and then after the fact, some of my teachers are like, well, why didn't you just ask us? And I had to be honest and be like, think about it. And I went back to them and said, you know what, I was just afraid of the negative feedback, or that, whatever it was in that moment, but there was definitely some fear or some lack of confidence there. And so I think what we really need to lean into is to tell our teachers what we can tell them. There's this distrust of administration, and part of it is because we treat everything like it has to be a secret, and not everything has to be a secret. I'm not saying that we don't have things that are confidential. We do, personnel matters and financial matters and things like that. But I think that that's a small piece of the pie, and there's a large rest of the pie that we can be telling our teachers. And so be honest, keep them up to date on things in meetings, try to collaborate and get their feedback on things. And then you can say, okay, look, I'm going to take all your feedback, and then I'm going to think about it, and then I'm going to make the decision. And it's still your decision, but then they're part of the process. And so that's one way to avoid the bad habit of a lack of transparency. All right. So we're looking at the 8 worst leadership habits and how to break them. Number 1, micromanaging. Number 2, avoiding conflict. Number 3, not listening. Number 4, lack of transparency. And that brings us to habit number 5, which is letting your integrity slip. So you know how much I talk about integrity on this podcast, and I just believe it's the cornerstone of effective leadership, and that when our integrity slips, that just destroys trust, and the entire school community can suffer. And, we're trying to build a culture of trust and respect. And when we compromise our integrity as leaders, it crushes that, it bankrupts it. All of those deposits that we've made in the emotional bank accounts of our teachers and our staff, you can just overdraw all of those accounts by letting your integrity slip. And that comes through dishonesty or inconsistency or unethical behavior, or those kinds of things that will impact, staff morale and parent trust. And ultimately it's going to harm the school's reputation. And so I mentioned at the top of the episode about how some of these things are situational. I'll just speak for myself. I mean, as important as integrity is to me, when I'm compromised, that's when it's very difficult for me to preserve my integrity. And so if I'm not feeling well, or if I'm tired, if I'm dehydrated, if I'm feeling sad about something, if I'm feeling really stressed, if I'm feeling, worn out emotionally, or I have decision fatigue because it's just been a really long week, or, I'm feeling a lot of pressure on situation X, those are the moments when it's easier to just do the convenient thing and then maybe, try to cover it up or try to be evasive about, where that came from, or, you know what I'm talking about. And so I think that it's just important to remember how high stakes it is for us to maintain our integrity, and then also remember how hard it is when we are, especially when we are compromised. And so a couple of tips or action steps to break this habit is just to make a strong commitment to ethical decision making, and to do the right thing even when it's hard. You know, they say that the definition of integrity is what you do when no one is watching. You know, doing the right thing even when it is hard. And that's especially true when parents are ramping up the pressure on us to do a thing. It's really, really difficult, but it's really, really important to just stick with that ethical behavior, that ethical decision making. And, you know, that just builds the trust and the accountability and the communication with our staff. And then just reflection. I think reflection is really important. And after we've made decisions, especially when it was borderline whether we were going to let our integrity slip, or maybe we did let it slip, is to get back on track. But I think reflection is important, especially with regards to our integrity. All right, that brings us to habit number 6, which is losing sight of the student. So we have so many responsibilities, and we have so many things that we have to do every single day, that we tend to focus on the tyranny of the urgent. And I work with someone who coined it the latest and loudest. And, you know, that's what we work on. We play whack-a-mole with our hair on fire while putting out fires with the little fire extinguisher that we carry around on our belt. You know, that's kind of my visual imagery for a private school leader. And if we're doing that all day long, we're dealing with the problems that are right in front of us. And sometimes we're just trying to expedite things and trying to make decisions. But if we forget why we're doing this, if we forget who we're doing this for, if we forget who is at the center of all of this, the student, then we're probably going to do things that we regret. And so this kind of detachment from, with losing sight of the student, let's just call it some detachment, that leads to us making decisions that might prioritize administrative convenience for me or for the admin team or for the board. It might prioritize financial considerations over student needs. It might prioritize a parent's preferences or a veteran teacher's preferences over what's best for the child. And then that diminishes the quality of education. It erodes trust. And it really is not aligned with why we're doing what we're doing, which is serving these kids. And so we know that it's important. Well, what are a few things that we can do to make sure we don't lose sight of our students? Well, I think an important one is to be with the kids. And you're like, well, I'm with the kids. Okay, most private school leaders that I talk to, when I ask them, what is the thing that you wish that you had more time to do? I would say probably over 80% of them say, you know, I wish I had more time in classrooms, more time with kids. And so I think that the more that we make it a priority, the more that we put it into our schedule, the more that we are spending time with them. And I'm not casting any shade or blaming anyone here. You know, we get stuck in our offices because of external factors that are keeping us in our offices. But the thing that we can do to overcome that is to be more intentional about our calendar, to redefine urgent and important, to not be dipping in and out of our email all day long. You know, some of these things that I just mentioned, I can definitely teach you how to do that in Thrive Academy. You can check that out at theprivateschoolleader.com/thrive. But, you know, there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. But if we're in our office all the time and we're not around kids very much, it becomes easy to detach our decision-making and our thinking from that. And then the second way to break this bad habit is to, when we're making a decision, is to ask yourself the question, how does this affect the kids? And so if it's a financial decision, if it's a staffing decision, if it's a decision about curriculum or athletics or whatever the case might be, you just ask yourself, how does this affect the kids? And you're going to find that you're going to be able to break that bad habit of losing sight of the kids. All right, we're up to habit number 7, which is drifting into positional leadership. And we know that positional leadership relies on authority and the title of head of school or principal or division head rather than of influence and inspiration and being a servant leader. And positional leadership is that top-down hierarchical approach, kind of command and control, coercion instead of cooperation. And that just destroys trust. It discourages collaboration and creativity and professional growth and risk-taking and effective communication and so many things. And we know that our teachers do not want to work for a positional leader. They want to work for a servant leader. And so I think that most private school leaders are servant leaders, but I think that sometimes we drift into positional leadership when we feel insecure or when we're just worn out and stressed out, and it's about shortcuts. Okay, so I think there are very few. There's a subset of leaders in private schools who drift into positional leader because they like to throw their weight and their authority around. But I think for the most part, if this happens, it's happening because we're compromised emotionally and physically, and that's why we're doing it. Okay, so how are we going to break this habit of drifting into positional leadership? Well, first of all, we're going to focus on servant leadership. Am I serving first and leading second, or am I leading and wanting coercion and compliance instead of cooperation? And then we want to model inspirational leadership. So you can show the values and the behaviors that you want from your team by being approachable and having a predictable mood and being supportive and intentionally encouraging them and being visible and showing that you're a servant and that there's no task that's beneath you. All of that proves and shows that inspirational servant leadership approach instead of just authority. No one wants to follow that positional leader. And then finally, on that list of how to break this habit is to empower your team. Delegate responsibilities, encourage initiative, provide opportunities for professional development. If you empower and enable and optimize your team, then they're going to rise, and the whole thing is going to be like a high tide event, and all the boats are going to rise. And so I think there's some insecurity there sometimes when we drift into positional leadership, but understandably so, but it is not how people want to be led. So we're going to break that habit. And that brings us to our final habit number 8, and that's not taking care of yourself. And I intentionally put this one last because I wanted to make a point that not taking care of yourself, that whole idea of self-care, if it's on the list, it's usually last on the list. And that's why I put it here today. Neglecting self-care, we know, leads to burnout. It leads to compromised leadership, in my opinion. It leads to physical problems. Sometimes it can lead to mental health problems. It can lead to wanting to get out of school leadership. And we do not do a good job across the board, with very few exceptions. We do not do a very good job of taking care of ourselves, prioritizing self-care, trying to maintain our health, trying to maintain decent nutrition. We just don't. And so a habit that I think is probably the most difficult for us to break as school leaders is not taking care of ourselves. And so a couple of tips is to just be intentional about, scheduling some time in the evening and in the weekend when you're not engaged with school, and building some margin into your life, and then trying to engage in some activity that just gets your body moving, or that's something that you enjoy doing. And I can hear what you're saying. You're like, yeah, right, I don't have time to do that. And it's like, well, you don't have time not to do that, but it's going to be like a New Year's resolution that's not going to go anywhere unless it's a sustainable strategy with some small chunked action steps and some tracking and just being able to do it slowly over time. And again, that's where I'm going to plug Thrive Academy, because that's a big chunk of what we do in this online digital course. which is to teach you how to create sustainable margin in your life as a private school leader. And I really think that it can make a huge difference for you. But, taking care of ourselves is a bad habit, and most of us are not very good at that. So the big takeaways from today's episode: the 8 worst leadership habits. Number 1, micromanaging. Number 2, avoiding conflict. Number 3, not listening. Number 4, lack of transparency. Number 5, letting integrity slip. Number 6, losing sight of the student. Number 7, drifting into positional leadership. And number 8, not taking care of yourself. And so I always end every episode with a call to action. And my request of you is to just reflect, to take 15 minutes this week and to think, okay, from these 8 bad habits, which one is the worst for me? Which one is the toughest? Which one is the most impactful in a negative way in my leadership? And so you're going to pick one out of the 8, and then you're going to apply one strategy to one habit. That's it. And you're going to see a difference. And so reflect, pick one habit, and then apply one strategy. So I want to wrap it up by telling you about another free guide that I've created. And, we all have parents at our school that can be, most of our parents, I think, are great, and some of them can be demanding and difficult and emotional. And, that's part of the job, is working with difficult parents. And so I have this free guide for you. It's called 5 Strategies to Help You Work with Difficult Parents. And I believe it can give you the tools you need to build better relationships and have better meetings with the difficult parents at your school. And you can get this for free over at theprivateschoolleader.com/parents. And it's just a way to say thank you for listening every week. So the 5 strategies to help you work with difficult parents, just grab that for free at theprivateschoolleader.com/parents. And I just really appreciate you and appreciate all of your hard work. If you want to check out the show notes for today's episode, they're at theprivateschoolleader.com/episode 98. And I'm on Instagram at The Private School Leader and on Twitter at The PS Leader. And if you got value from this episode, I would really appreciate it if you would just text or email the link to the podcast to another school leader that you know, or to an aspiring leader at your school. And I've been your host, Mark Minkus. I just appreciate you so much and all of the hard work that you're doing at your school. You're rocking it. It's hard. It's very emotional work, and it's lonely work, but you are doing an amazing job. And I just want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy week to join me here today. And I'll see you next time right here on the Private School Leader Podcast. And until then, always remember to serve first, lead second, and make a difference.